Please don't weep or cry for me, for I am with the Lord today.
Thank you, Marla. And now, Heather, if you would like to come forward.
How do you tell the story of a man like my dad, Alec Lawson, who accomplished so much over his lifetime that spanned 93 years? Well, I'll start at the beginning. Dad was born in 1926, the fourth and youngest child in a very poor mining family in Scotland. He arrived in this world unplanned and unwelcome. His no-nonsense mother, Nancy, was already struggling to feed 3 other children, and she made no secret that Alec was an unwanted burden on the family. Imagine how that shaped a wee laddie. Fortunately, my dad's father was also named Alex, was a kind and loving man who found joy in each and every one of his children, and he often referred to them as his medals. The story goes that when Nancy sent her husband down to register this wailing newborn, his father decided to stop at the local pub. After toasting his new son, his third son, with his mates, he decided, by God, this is my last one, I'll name him after myself. And he did. When Nancy discovered what her husband had done, she was livid and she swore she would never call him Alexander. And she never did. Henceforth, my dad was known to everyone in Scotland as Alistair. Notwithstanding a bit of a domineering mother, my dad developed an irrepressible sense of humor, one that often got him in a lot of trouble. He gained a reputation around town as a wild laddie, frequently at the center of mischief. For example, at the age of 3, his mum told the story of the local police bringing him home because he'd been throwing rocks through an abandoned window. Then there was the time that the sewer system on their street backed up. And it was because Dad thought it would be funny to flush his wee dungarees down the toilet. And as the workers dug up the street and all the women were gawking and peering, trying to find out what the blockage was, his mother was horrified when she recognized her son's wee trousers as the cause and quickly shuffled them back into the house. Too young for war, but not for the equally dangerous work in the coal mines, my dad spent his teen years toiling underground in West Lothian's mines, the coal fields near Edinburgh. He sought relief from the danger and the drudgery by attending church, by learning the bagpipes, and by playing epic practical jokes on his mates. Alex is probably the only person that ever got fired from the coal mines for having too much fun. Like many who have known hunger, my father developed a legendary love of food, and he was particularly fond of sweets, custards, cakes, breads. The man never met a carb he didn't love. Mischief did get him out of the mines, but it was the pipes that proved to be the ticket to a better life. In 1950, in Montreal, placed an ad in the Edinburgh Evening News looking for Scottish pipers to play at the store each day as well as learn a trade. Alec responded and shortly thereafter boarded a tramper steamer for a new life in Canada, leaving behind family, friends, and everything that was familiar to him. Upon arriving in Canada, Dad embraced the name on his birth certificate. He became Alexander, Alex for short. The new country agreed with him. The food was better, job safety actually meant something, and there was no shortage of admiring young women, sweet on the tall, strapping lad in his full Highland dress. Incredibly, his piping didn't scare off the best-looking one. He caught the eye of my mom, Joy, a bonny lass working behind Ogilvy's handkerchief counter, and who was also determined to marry a handsome Scotsman just like her father. The two soon fell in love and began their life together. Dad joined the Bell Telephone, where my mom's dad and brothers already worked, and began his training as an installer. But God had other plans for my father. Dad was deeply spiritual in his teens, and by his early 20s, he felt a call to the clergy. With only a grade 8 education, he enrolled in night school and he studied hard, and he eventually passed the entrance exams to McGill University. He obtained a degree in theology and soon thereafter was ordained as a minister in the United Church of Canada. His boss at the Bell Telephone, Mac Willock, was dismayed to lose such a promising company man to God. Alex would have made an excellent telephone man, he lamented. Dad described himself as a lonely child growing up, haunted by the knowledge that he wasn't wanted. To him, the solution was simple: have a big family. To that end, Alex married Joy, and the two soon got busy raising a rambunctious family of 6. Some born, some chosen, many fostered. Ministering to a large flock also made him feel wanted. He cherished his congregations and the many people who sought comfort in his therapy. What is more, each Sunday he was guaranteed a captive audience, and he rejoiced in the countless free meals at weddings, church suppers, community events, and yes, even funerals. Preaching was his dream job. Perhaps the icing on the cake was the grudging admiration of his mother, who marveled at her wild laddie who had finally brought respect to the family. 6 decades after emigrating to his adopted country, Alex's love of the pipes, Burns poetry, and the Holy Land, Scotland, all remained intact. Even at the end, his undiminished accent suggested that he had just got off the boat. There are none more Scot than the Scots abroad. And at 93, Dad could still sing and recite many of the songs and poems of Robert Burns, Scotland's beloved bard, which put him in high demand on the Burns dinner circuit. Dad loved wearing his full Highland regalia, and he wore it proudly when he officiated at our wedding in 2012. On that wonderful day, we used his dirk to cut our wedding cake. Dad had it engraved and gifted it to Garth and I on the condition that he could have it back every January to make the rounds at the Burn dinners, reciting the Selkirk Grace, the toast to the haggis, and the toast to the immortal memory of Rabbie Burns. Indeed, Dad was just the kind of Scotsman that Burns exalted in his poetry. Born poor but proud, he found strength and happiness in his Scottish heritage, his family, his church, and his tireless sense of humor. Dad often used to say, my riches have come from my poverty. That proved true during his final days when that unwanted wee laddie from West Lothian departed this world, cherished and surrounded by love and laughter and song. So, Dad, here's to your immortal memory. Love your own wee lassie, chickie.
A little bit about me. I'm Rowan. I was Alex's grandson, and, well, I loved him very much. It's enough about me. Let's talk about Alex. I really admired him as a grandfather, even in the end, because he had something that I'd never seen in anyone else. He had no resentment. He didn't want to change anything. He was happy with what he had, and he enjoyed what he had. He saw what was around him and accepted it for what it was and rejoiced in it.
And now, Wendall, would you come forward?
We marched a lot of miles together. When Alex came over, when Ogilvy's brought him over, the owner of Ogilvy's was Colonel Nesbitt, who was former commanding officer of the Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment of Canada. And so George Morgan, his mate, and Alex joined the Black Watch, and they played with the watch for about 2 years. And then they came over to the new Air Force band. I started the Black Watch myself as a kid in '46, and then by the time Alec got there, I'd been playing at the Air Force for 4 years, I guess. But I give Alex credit because the summer that his last summer with the Black Watch, he'd promised to go up to Ontario to some of the games there and compete with the Black Watch, and he missed a great trip to Scotland. The Air Force, our former commanding officer was the president of Air Canada, or at that time it was called Trans-Canada Airlines, and gave us a 15-day trip, and one of the best trips I've ever been on, and we got to the World Championships and all kinds of other things, the Cowell Games, and But Alec, you give him credit, he had promised the Blackwatch that he would compete with them that summer, and he and George stayed then and missed the trip. But I always thought that was pretty decent of him. That tradition of Ogilvy's, it just ended last year. I don't know. I'm going back to Montreal this year, and I hope to find out what happened, why they discontinued having the piper open the store and close it each day. See if I can find out. Anyway, Alex and I then played together from the end of 51 to 1958. A bunch of us left the Air Force in 58 and we formed a private band, and Alex was pretty heavy into his studies then, leaning towards the ministry. We had about 5 guys in the band at that time, and they were all guys from Scotland who, a lot of them hadn't even finished high school, but they went to school at night. They all had jobs. They went to night school. They got their high school leaving, and then they went on to university, and most of them had pretty good careers. And the rest of the guys in the band, including myself, we were all college students at the time, so we had a pretty studious bunch in that band. The 401 is the 401 Fighter Squadron, and most of our pilots at the beginning were Battle of Britain pilots, and they treated us like their own kids. So we certainly appreciated their attention. And when he first came, I was 16 in 1951, and he was 25. So we valued his knowledge and experience, the fact that he had played in bands in Scotland. And eventually he became corporal piper, and then from 54 until 58 he became the sergeant piper of the band, which is next to the pipe major, and he played under the great Alec MacLean, which may mean nothing to most of you people, but if you know anything about piping or piping history in Canada, heard about Alec MacLean. As I say, a lot of these fellows who came over, they appreciated education and they went after it and did very well. As Heather mentioned, he was a prankster, a storyteller, tricks and jokes, but there was a lot of humor involved in most of it, and he wasn't mean or nasty with his pranks. I suppose I could tell you one little story. When we played at the games in those days, back in Ontario, Quebec, it was a tradition that every band, win or lose, you'd always get 2 cases of beer and a bottle of whiskey. So this particular day was the 1st of July, 1955, and the pipe major we had taken an overnight train to Toronto, and then we took another train from there to London, and the games were at Embro, a little town outside of London. And anyway, so we didn't have the pipe major with us. We had the former pipe major, who was World War I vet and pretty well past his playing days, but he used to travel around with us. He had the rank of flight sergeant, and his name was Jock Laurie. And old Jock was the type of guy that nobody could ever put anything over on him. I can give you a couple of his famous expressions. I know where the monkey sleeps. We didn't know what that meant at first. And secondly, I didn't come over on a bloody tricycle, he used to tell us. When he came over in 1921. But he had never met Lawson and a few other guys we had in the band there. So anyway, the guys, old Jock was in charge of the band, and we stayed overnight at the base at Aylmer, which is just south of St. Thomas. And so he says, look, you can have the beer, but I don't want you going in there half pie-eyed. He says, we're guests here at this base. So anyway, he sits across from the driver in the front seat, and he falls asleep. He's snoring away there, and he puts the bottle of whiskey between his feet, see, on the floor of the bus. And so Alec crept up on his hands and knees up the aisle, puts an empty Coke bottle in the place of the whiskey bottle, and he takes the whiskey and it goes to the back of the bus, disappears. And So as we're coming into the gate at the base of Aylmer, old Jock wakes up and he looks down and he sees this empty Coke bottle. Well, he threw a fit. Of course, he was going to put us all in charge. We were going to get kicked out of the Air Force and went on and on, you see. So, but that's the type of thing Alec was often involved in there. I could go on for a couple of hours, but I won't. He was probably the last person we expected to become a minister, but it was it was probably a bit of a shock to us when we found out. They started calling him Lawson the Parson, and after anyway, when he went on his student teaching stint for 3 years, it just so happened that he was sent to the region where I was born, in that part of Quebec, in the county of Argenteuil, or Argenteuil as the English call it. And he was in the next village to where I was born, where a lot of uncles and cousins lived. So I used to see him. I worked up until I was about 30 on my uncle's farms every summer, and good change from the classroom. So I kept in touch with Alec, and I'd see him quite often. But then, of course, he went west when he got his divinity degree, and after he finished his practice, being his practice student minister. And we didn't really see much of him for about 30 years. We kept in touch, but then we had a couple of reunions, one in 1994, the year before I left Montreal. Alex came back to that and stayed with me, and a couple of other people from the West came back, and then we had another one. So many of the individuals in the band had moved to the western part of the continent, either in Canada or the States, that we had the next reunion was in '98 in Calgary. So we saw Alec there, and one of his daughters, I think Sheena, who sang at the reunion, and he's been in Victoria for the last 6 years. Sometimes we come to the Pipers Club, not too much the last couple of years, but before that, and he always came to our monthly Black Watch luncheons. Almost every month, he hardly ever missed one of those. Anyway, he was a great friend and one of the best friends I ever had. Just add one more thing. Heather mentioned about the coal mining. I was going to mention it, but I didn't want to see pretty well told the story. But Alec told us that story many times. There was no way that he and his friend Robbie were going to spend the rest of their life in a bloody coal mine. So it was like being in the army. You couldn't just leave a coal mine. You were conscripted in there, and coal was during the war and just after to the British economy. And so the only way that they could get out, they damaged enough equipment that they finally threw them out. That was the only way.
I inserted myself in the program, but you didn't know because you might have left if you'd seen it. I was worried that perhaps some of you would have to leave early and go to wherever you came from, so I wanted to get this chance to thank you. But I managed to visit with a lot of you before the service started, so that was nice. Some of you are here, as Alana said, because you knew Alec, but perhaps not me, and some of you are here because you know me and perhaps not Alec. And I guess most of you know most of us. So I just wanted to continue a little bit of what other people said, but concentrate on the two things that impressed me about Alec. And one of them was his love for people, which we've seen that, and his energy and enthusiasm that just couldn't be squelched no matter what you did. Alec was game for anything. I think his secret was, though, that he went to bed about 9:30 at night, whereas mine's a lot later. And, of course, his love of people and friends begins with his children and grandchildren, his family. And in the 50s, men didn't often handle babies, but not Alec. As soon as that first baby came, he claimed it. And in order, he gave them pet names, love names. And if he were to introduce his family today, they'd be Bean, Blullo, Chicky, Chacho, Yakadoo, Muffy, and Dodie. And Darling. And translated, of course, he had one for Rowan, too. Rowan's the wee man. And now it's translated, that would be Sandy, David, Heather, Sheena, Peter, Marla, and Doreen. I'm still battling. He loves meeting new people, as you've heard, and finding out who they are and remembering them. And he's still, Wendall's still writing to Vera McMahon, because Alec's 4-point charge was where Wendall is from. And she and Alec were still writing to each other. If you were his friend, you were his friend for life. And many, many letters crossed the miles until computers came into our lives. And then he wrote every single week on Friday. He wrote 3 columns or blogs or whatever they're called Blether, Havering, and Clype. Now, Anne Logie will be able to translate those Scottish words into English. But you don't need to tell anyone, though, especially Clype. About 90 people receive these a week. And he remembered names and situations of friends from years back. And this is one of his Bibles. He's had this for years. It's become a family heirloom. Every friend he ever knew, this is it. And the heirloom is claimed by our daughter, Chacha or Sheena. She has asked for this years ago. She said, Dad, I want that. So this is one of his Bibles. All his friends are in here. Now, he liked to meet new people, and I was only listening to Heather talking about how he filled himself for what he lacked when he was a child. Of course, that's why. He likes friends, and they're good friends, and he treasures them. If he couldn't find a familiar face, he'd talk to a stranger. When we'd go in a restaurant for lunch or something, Alec would scan who's it he can talk to and see, and I would go right to an empty booth and sit down. And it wasn't that I wasn't sociable, but, you interrupt people's meals, and it's not that much fun. So one time when we first moved to Moose Jaw, we went into one of those large old banks building, and there's several people waiting in line, and he caught the eye of a woman that maybe to him looked familiar. He liked to see what the new people are going to be like in this town. So he says, hello, how are you? And then he steps back. Have you met my wife? She says, I haven't met you. But he would do. He would just love that. And I mentioned his energy. He arranged 2 groups of teenagers to go to Expo from Saskatchewan by train to Montreal. He did weekend retreats. He led groups at night. He loved weddings. And one Saturday, and of course his energy, he was over at the church in Moose Jaw playing 4 square. Is that the one with the rope and the ball? And anyway, with some teenagers in his runners, in his jeans, and the sanctuary and the hall were connected by a glazed hall. And he looked out and he saw some people all dressed up going into the church. And, of course, he had a wedding that he didn't realize that the time had flown by. He didn't have time to come home and change and get into his gown. He had runners and jeans on, so he found an old black, long choir gown. And he had the caretaker wire one of his collars on it. And he went over to perform the service, and he's telling the story like he doesn't know what an embarrassment is. He was telling the story to us, and he said, when I was up in the pulpit, I had to walk like Groucho Marx so that my gown would cover the runners. So, speaking of weddings, one time he came home from performing a wedding, and he said, Joy, that was my 100th wedding. I said, really? I said, which bride was the most memorable? He said, the first one. Oh, I said, the girl in the blue suit that got married at the manse and I picked flowers for her out of the garden? He says, no, and he smiled. My first bride. Oh, you got it. I wasn't sure about that. Anyway, one of the reasons why I inserted myself in here is that it gives me a chance to thank Dorothy, whom Alec, again from his bed, wanted Dorothy, and your wonderful singers. And Kim, thank you for making this the first time you did a public performance. Yeah. And, of course, Alana, who brought this all together. And each of you has your own reason for being here today. And when this is ended, if Alec were here, he would race down the aisle. He was the fastest gal in the West. That's what people would say. To make it to the door so he could shake hands with everybody before they left. So that's what he'd do. He'd put out his hand for your hand. Your hand would, and when your hand went in there, he'd put his other hand over. So actually, he had you trapped. And he wouldn't let go until he knew something more about you or something about you if you were new.